Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. I'm going to continue our little series on prophetic voices in the First Testament. I'm going to read from 1Kings 18 and beginning at verse 22. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God. And all the people agreed. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it, and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, O Baal, answer us. But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. You'll have to shout louder, he scoffed, for surely he's a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming or is relieving himself. Or maybe he is away on a trip or is asleep and needs to be wakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound. No reply, no response. Then Elijah called to the people, Come over here. They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood. After they had done this, he said, Do the same thing again. And when they were finished, he said, Now do it a 3rd time. So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself. Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, The Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord is God. Well, as we've listened to the prophetic voice of Elijah over the last few weeks, it's become apparent that Elijah has gone through a process of deepening faith and trust and confidence in God, all of which appears to be preparing him for the great showdown between himself and the prophets of Baal. In reality, of course, this has always been a contest between the Lord and Baal. King Ahab, encouraged by his wife Jezebel, had abandoned the Lord and had begun worshipping her gods. Furthermore, encouraged by the king, the majority of the people had followed him in that idolatry. The people who had not completely gone over to worship Baal had settled for a mixture of the 2 faiths by worshipping both Yahweh and Baal side by side. One thing that all the prophetic voices of the First Testament tell us is that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not just one God among many. He will not be worshipped alongside a false god. He alone is worthy of our worship. Through Elijah, the Lord had commanded a drought on the land, which had brought famine, disease, and death, all of which were intended to make the people see that Baal was no god at all and to redirect them to worshipping the Lord. Baal was supposed to be the storm god in charge of the rain, yet it appeared that he was powerless to do anything about the drought that Yahweh had commanded. However, Baal's devotees would have done their best to explain away his inability to produce rain, and so a more definite demonstration of the Lord's power and supremacy was necessary. Ahab had blamed all of Israel's troubles on Elijah, but Elijah refused to accept the blame and pointed the finger of blame right back at Ahab and his family and their desertion of the Lord and promotion of false gods. The Lord had warned the people what would happen in this eventuality. He said in Deuteronomy 28, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees that I'm giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you iron. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. It will come down from the skies until you're destroyed. Ahab could try and pass the blame elsewhere, but the truth was that Elijah had an airtight case against him. For despite the fact that he was aware of this warning from God's word, Ahab had still led the people away from the Lord. Sadly, Ahab had not learned the lesson of the drought, and so Elijah made a proposal that would settle once and for all which God was the true God. He would host a competition between the Lord and Baal on Mount Carmel. Ahab could hardly refuse, especially since Elijah would be outnumbered 850 to 1, and the competition would take place on Baal's home ground. The fact is that people have always wanted some physical sign to prove the claims of faith. We read in Matthew 16 verse 1, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. In John 2 verse 18 we read again that the Jews asked him for a sign, and in John 4 verse 48 we read that Jesus said, unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, you will never believe. It seems that there is kind of embedded in the consciousness of humankind an almost irrepressible desire for the rational, visible proofs on which to base beliefs. But Jesus reversed that order. Faith comes first, then reason follows to undergird and confirm. But the yearning for evidence, so deeply embedded in human experience, has been reinforced in our day, in our time, by reverence, a kind of almost religious reverence for the scientific method with its quest for demonstrated certainty. The desire for convincing signs dies slowly. And that desire was very much alive in Elijah's day. The people wanted some visible proof that Yahweh was the true God. And this time, God was willing to give them that spectacular sign they wanted. So the scene is set for one of the most dramatic and memorable encounters in the whole of the First Testament. Just before the competition gets underway, Elijah gives the people one more opportunity to stop wavering or hopping between two opinions and decide whom they will follow. Will they follow the Lord or Baal? The people remain silent, condemned by their half-hearted, double-minded indecision. And Elijah's claim to be the only remaining prophet of the Lord is clearly an exaggeration, since the text has already told us earlier about the 100 prophets of the Lord that Obadiah had hidden in caves. What he probably meant, was that he alone was the prophet who had stood publicly for God and the only prophet of the Lord on the mountain to challenge the prophets of Baal. Elijah avoided any accusations of unfairness by allowing the prophets of Baal to go first and prepare their sacrifice. He allows them to make the first choice of the bull that they'll use and allows them to take as long as they want to call on their God. The deciding factor in this competition will be fire from heaven. And everyone's agreed that God, the God who answers by fire, is the true God. The prophets of Baal could hardly object to this, since he was supposed to be the storm god, the god of wind and rain and lightning. If anyone could answer by fire, surely it would be Baal. And the prophets of Baal called out to him from morning until noon, but there was no response. They danced around his altar, calling out to him, but were met with only silence from heaven. When Baal did not answer the cries of his followers, Elijah did something that would have been really absolutely shocking to the people of ancient times. He mocked Baal. In the ancient world, the prevalent attitude was that although you might not worship the God of another people, might even consider it a false God to some degree, its status as a god was taken for granted. By mocking him, Elijah refuses to grant Baal as a god at all. Having taunted their God, Elijah then began to taunt the worshippers by making mock excuses for his silence. He suggests that perhaps Baal is deep in thought, or he's away on a journey, travelling somewhere, or perhaps he's asleep. Elijah even went as far in his mockery that he suggested that Baal couldn't answer their prayers because he was on the toilet. Had the prophets of Baal not been in such a state of ecstatic worship, they might have reacted angrily to Elijah's taunts. Instead, they unwittingly join in the joke by taking Elijah's mocking advice and crying all the louder. And then, in what was probably a funeral rite for the temporarily dead Baal, they cut themselves to demonstrate their commitment and to attract their god's attention. The prophets of Baal became frantic in their efforts to arouse him to answer them by fire. And so for another 3 hours or so, they danced around the altar, cutting themselves and calling out to their God. And the text is very blunt about the result. Excuse me. There was no response. No one answered. No one paid any attention. This response, or rather this lack of response, was inevitable. For Elijah's point all along had been that Baal was no god at all. And since that was the case, he could not answer their cries, no matter how long or how fervently they called out to him. The prophets had been given a fair chance to have their God answer by fire. They had called out to him all day. They had the choice of which bull to sacrifice, and they were on home ground. And they outnumbered Elijah 850 to 1. The 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. Now it was Elijah's turn as he went about things quite differently from the prophets of Baal. In contrast to their frenzied efforts, he appears quite calm and dignified. Not only has he given the prophets of Baal every advantage, he now goes out of his way to disadvantage himself and his God. The first thing Elijah did was to rebuild an altar of the Lord that lay in ruins on the mountain. It may have been destroyed during Jezebel's purges, during the priests and prophets of Yahweh, or perhaps it's simply the apathy of the people was such that it just led to its disuse and it just kind of fell apart. The 12 stones that Elijah used to rebuild the altar were a reminder to the people of Israel that they were a people who were supposed to live in covenant relationship with God. But Elijah went further than that. He also used 12 jars of water, 4 jars poured out 3 times. And in his prayer in verse 36, instead of mentioning Jacob, he mentions him by his new covenant name, Israel. He was calling the nation of Israel back to God. Elijah's preparations were a visual illustration to the people who knew well what the number 12 represented. The kingdom of Israel consisted of 10 tribes and the kingdom of Judah 2. But those 12 tribes were all part of one kingdom before the people ran after idols and false gods. And its division into 2 kingdoms was a testimony to the havoc that sin creates. Having rebuilt the altar, he then dug a trench around it. And once the wood and the sacrifice were prepared on the altar, he then commanded them to pour water over the offering so that the offering, the wood, the altar were all soaked and the trench was filled with water. The them in question he calls to come closer must of course be either the prophets of Baal or the people who worshipped him. So once more there could be no doubt or question of the fact that the competition is heavily weighted in Baal's favour. Having called the people to draw near, they could be sure there was no trickery or magic involved in what was about to happen. By the time all of this was done, it was the time of the evening sacrifice, around 3 p.m. And so Elijah stepped forward. And you can just imagine the scene, I guess, this hush would settle over the crowd who must have been really done in and weary, having cut themselves and been bleeding for hours and dancing around and carrying on. This hush settles over the crowd. The exhausted prophets of Baal must have tensed up, wondering what was going to happen next. And what happened next is once more in stark contrast to what had happened earlier. Unlike the prophets of Baal, who cried out for hours, Elijah prayed a simple prayer, but what a prayer it is. Elijah's prayer is all about the glory of God and the renown of his name. His own people, the people he had chosen from all the nations of the world, the people he had brought up out of Egypt, the people he had led into the promised land, they had deserted him for false idols. As a result, God's glory and name were not only being trampled on in Israel, but had also become the object of ridicule and derision amongst the surrounding nations. And Elijah begins his prayer by reminding God of times in the past when he intervened on behalf of his people for the sake of his name, in the lives of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And he effectively calls him to act now for the sake of his people and for the sake of his name and his glory. In doing so, he also reminds God as well as the people of God's own covenant with them. If God fails to answer now, then all those previous interventions in human history will have been for nothing. And God's name will remain an object of scorn and ridicule throughout the world. He would be known as the God who allowed his people to desert him and worship idols. He would be known as the God who was powerless to act in defense of his people or his name. The time had come for the Lord to prove that he is the Lord and that there is no other God beside him. Elijah's prayer was motivated by a passion for the glory of God among his people. He had shown that Baal was dead. Now he needed to show that God was alive. And the answer to Elijah's prayer was as dramatic as it was swift. The competition began with the assertion that the God who answered by fire would be declared the true God. When Elijah called out to the Lord answered immediately by fire, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, even the stones and the soil were consumed in that holy fire, and the heat of it evaporated the water in the trench. The answer was decisive. Baal had remained silent despite all the pleadings of his prophets because he was no God at all. Yahweh, on the other hand, had answered immediately as his lone prophet prayed. He proved that he alone was God, and none of the people could now deny it. When the Lord answered by fire, the people fell to the ground, no doubt in some fear and terror that the fire of God's judgment might fall upon them also for having worshipped Baal. However, God's purpose in allowing this contest was not to bring judgment upon them, but to show them that he is God and to call them back to covenant faithfulness. And the first step to that return was their acknowledgement that the Lord alone is God. Every journey begins with a single step. The people didn't have to tear down their altars to Baal and get rid of their idols and idolatrous practices before they could return to the Lord. All of those things would have to happen once they had come back. But the journey back to covenant faithfulness began with that first step of acknowledging that the Lord alone is God. And it's the same for us. We cannot put our lives right before we come back to God. We must first come back to God and allow him to begin putting our lives right. And that journey begins, like all journeys do, with a single step. The big question is, will we take that step? Thanks for listening.